I'm just getting our technology set up.
Amazing. Can everyone hear me? Okay, perfect. Camila, I can't see you, but can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, great. All right, let's get started. So thank you so much, Marissa, for inviting us to this space. We're both excited to be here with all of you today, and we hope this can be a really meaningful discussion during the Q&A. And so we invite you to participate in that as feels comfortable and you're able to today. But we're going to be talking about anti-racist leadership and compassionate accountability. For accessibility purposes, I'm going to describe our slide deck. All of the backgrounds are the same. We've got a dark purple background. In the lower left-hand corner of the screen, there's kind of a gradient, orange, pink, and green detail, which are some of our core brand colors. And in the upper right-hand corner is our Kneading Change logo. Camila and I comprise the organization Kneading Change. We knead into complex conversations and multitudes, just like we would knead into bread so that we can all collectively rise together. And that's showcased in our logo with two outlined orange fists, social justice fists, kneading into bread. On the right-hand wrist, there's a hot pink heart, and on the left-hand wrist, there's a lightning bolt. And so with that, let's get started. As I mentioned, Camila and I comprise Kneading Change, which is our narrative justice company. Our vision is a world in which every person is free to be the fullest expression of themselves. And we invite you to bring the fullest expression of yourself into this space with us today. We envision a world where communities and structures support thriving for all humans and do so in right relationship with the earth and her multitudes of life forms.
And we seek to create and facilitate spaces that enable justice-seeking adults to explore and prototype inclusive and affirming models of self and community care, interpersonal communication, and advocacy. And we do that through the coaching that we offer, whether that's one-to-one or in group coaching. We do that through consultation, and we also do that through facilitating different experiences.
So a little bit about us. On the screen, you'll see a photo of me with my name, Rachel A.R. Porter. I have two middle names. The photo is me wearing a light purple blazer with a black turtleneck. The background is black. I'm smiling and I'm wearing wampum earrings. I'm the co-founder of Kneading Change and a narrative change strategist. Today, I'm showing up in this space with short brown hair, a fun blue dyed highlight. I've got chandelier style navy blue earrings. I'm wearing a camel colored short sleeve shirt and a black necklace from the Indigenous designer Warren Stevens Scott. I also wear glasses. I use she, her pronouns, and I identify as a woman. A little bit about me. In addition to my work with Kneading Change, I am a passionate advocate for Indigenous communities. I identify as a mixed race, Haudenosaunee woman. I have a loving partner. I live in Chicago on Potawatomi lands. We have 3 cats together, and outside of Kneading Change and my social justice work, I'm a writer. So that's a little bit about me.
And my name is Camila Marquez. I use she and they pronouns. The picture of me that you see here, I'm actually wearing the same blouse that I'm wearing today. It's a bright red blouse with a lace mock turtleneck, and I have long dark hair that kind of goes into a rusty blonde color, and in the background you see Lake Michigan and a blurred outline of the Chicago skyline. Today, like I said, I'm wearing that same blouse. I'm a light-skinned brown person. I have brown eyes, and I'm wearing some gold dingly earrings that my little nephew, who just turned 3, picked out for me. I also have on some red lipstick. I'm also the co-founder of Kneading Change, and I'm a trauma-informed coach and facilitator. I come from a background of doing a lot of work with youth and peace building and community building with organizations like Peace Jam, Big Brothers Big Sisters, Tomorrow's Women, which look at creating systemic change within their neighborhoods or through mentorship programs, or looking across divides and finding ways to come and build together. I also am a creative. I love working on creative projects, and I bring a lot of that into our space, whether that's through somatics or writing exercises. And I currently work at a university doing a lot of diversity, equity, and inclusion work, as well as culturally responsive teaching. So that's a little bit about me.
So let's get into our conversation for today, bringing together anti-racist leadership and compassionate accountability. So often we hear these words in academia, in the business space, maybe in the workplace, but oftentimes they're not brought together in the same conversation. And so today we're putting forward this idea that compassionate accountability is an aspect of anti-racist leadership. It can be a tool for us to think about what living anti-racist leadership looks like on a day-to-day basis, and especially in the workplace. So on this slide, we've got some cropped and copy and pasted headlines from different news sources, as well as a book cover, which I'll describe in a minute. But as I mentioned, compassionate accountability is a conversation that's being had. The Seattle Times, one of their recent headlines is managers, compassion and accountability aren't mutually exclusive. Harvard Business Review is saying to be anti-racist, don't confuse character for accountability. There's more than just kindness to be anti-racist. And Forbes is talking about how to balance compassion and accountability for behavior change. It's important to note that we as Kneading Change did not invent compassionate accountability. We, of course, did not invent anti-racist leadership. There's a book you can read by Nate Rieger, PhD. There's a photo of the book on the screen. It's a blue background with a link graphic. It says how leaders build connection and get results, compassionate accountability. Today, we're going to be talking about what compassionate accountability means from our lens, but there's definitely other resources out there. So for Kneading Change, we absolutely think about compassionate accountability from a social justice framework. We think about it through our lens as advocates, writers, as trauma-informed coaches. And so we define compassionate accountability as the process of pointing out and taking responsibility for instances of harm in your community. These could happen at home, at work, in your local vicinity, or in the global environment. And when we acknowledge these instances of harm, compassionate accountability means embracing the information you're receiving from a place of humility and respect for yourself and others. One thing that's really important to think about with compassionate accountability is that you are part of the process. You may have heard practices of calling in or calling out. And I want to talk about those just a little bit to really talk about the nuance of compassionate accountability. Calling out inherently has a power dynamic. You may have heard of it in relationship to cancel culture. Calling out is about you taking a higher ground and looking down from a place of superiority at those who are behaving in a way that are not aligned with your values. Calling in, we would both say, is more aligned with compassionate accountability in that it's gentle. It's not about being right. It's about collective community, but it still maintains a power dynamic. So imagine a manager witnesses an instance of workplace harm, calls someone into their office, has a conversation about a behavior they saw that was problematic, but are not looking to punish, are looking more to educate. That could be, if done well, a positive example of calling in and is absolutely compassionate accountability. But true compassionate accountability removes the power dynamic. It includes you, whether you're a manager or an employee or a leader or whatever role you're participating in a project. Compassionate accountability includes a self-reflection process. And we're going to talk later on about how sometimes that self-reflection process, particularly as a manager, can be made transparent to your employees.
So we really want to emphasize the point that compassionate accountability starts small, like Rachel mentioned. Often it begins with that internal practice. It includes you. However, when we're thinking about it starting small, there are behaviors, there's language that we use in our day-to-day that can have an impact on the people around us, or we may also be impacted by the language and behaviors of others. A couple of these elements, you probably may have heard of microaggressions, but we also have micro affirmations. I don't know why it says microaggressions there twice, but there's these two elements, and these are small behaviors that do create an impact. Next to microaggressions, we see a frowny face, and this can be defined as the everyday, subtle, intentional, and oftentimes unintentional interactions or behaviors that communicate some sort of bias towards historically marginalized groups. So these can be things like mispronouncing someone's name. This can also be asking, where are you from? This can be touching someone's hair without consent. This can be saying, oh, you're not like other blank, insert any marginalized group there, people. It can also be prohibiting culturally specific hairstyles, clothing, etc. And this can create an immense amount of harm, even though it might seem small, even if it may be unintentional. And sometimes it is intentional, that can create an impact. On the other side, there's also microaffirmations. Again, I apologize for the typo there. Microaffirmations that has a smiley face next to it. And this was a term that was coined by Mary Rowe, and she described this as tiny acts of opening doors to opportunity, gestures of inclusion and caring, and graceful acts of listening. So these are really micro acts or language that creates a spirit of affirmation within the workplace community. So that can be things like remembering someone's name and pronouncing it correctly. That can be remembering small details. For example, right now we're in the holy month of Ramadan, so that could be remembering that your Muslim colleagues are fasting during this time. This can be giving kudos to a teammate for their contribution, or even recommending them or nominating them for the work that they've done. But all of these are movements towards this compassionate accountability. I think one thing that's really important to remember here is that whether these things are intentional or unintentional, whether we are meaning to do them or not, they do create an impact on the people around us and can create a community that is one of belonging or one that pushes people out. So it's really important to be aware of your language and your behaviors. I think the other thing that is really important is that if you are using micro affirmations, that you might not get a pat on the back for that. And really, you shouldn't. You should really be making the efforts to use language and have behaviors that are going to foster belonging within the workplace in each of your interactions. So if we're thinking about the psychology of belonging and how microaggressions and microaffirmations or even larger behaviors and language can support us, I'll be talking a little bit about how the brain works. And on this slide, you can see a picture of the brain. It's a graphic of a pink brain. And at the base of the brain where the brainstem is, you see a little orange dot. Above that, there's a green dot where the limbic system is. And then there's a dark purple dot towards the front of the brain, which is where the prefrontal lobes are. So in thinking about the psychology of belonging, our reptilian brain, which is where that orange dot is, that's like at the base of our brain, kind of where our head connects to our neck. So our reptilian brain is constantly scanning for threats. So microaggressions obstruct our sense of belonging and keep our amygdala, which is at the very top of our brain stem, the top of that reptilian brain. That's the part of our brain that senses threat and triggers our fight, flight, and freeze response. Microaggressions keep that part of our brain activated. And so we're going to be in that hypervigilant state, not knowing if we're safe or not. However, if we're developing those positive relations with things like microaffirmations or other language and behaviors that are part of compassionate accountability, that taps into our limbic system, which is our emotional brain. That's where that green dot is. And that releases oxytocin, which then calms the amygdala, which again, that's where that brown part is. That's in our reptilian brain. And it allows us to move into higher order thinking, which is where that purple dot is, the prefrontal lobes. So that allows us to really engage with the outside world in a deeper way because our nervous system is then calm down and we're able to actually engage with our surroundings from a place of safety.
So how can you practice compassionate accountability? It's simple and it's complex, right? As many things are. So sometimes it looks like listening from a place of love and mutual respect. It can look like sharing from a place of honesty and trust. It's reflecting transparently with yourself and others and interrogating the relationship between courage and fear. So an example of, I'll tell you, at Kneading Change, our ethic is all about having transparent facilitation. And so when we were preparing for this presentation, and it could easily happen again, I was forgetting to do the visual descriptions. That's a new growing edge for me. And Camila, because we have a culture of compassionate accountability at Kneading Change, was able to share with me from a place of honesty and trust that, hey, we need to include this in because we want to make our presentation as accessible as possible. And so because we had a culture of compassionate accountability and we practice this in all of our working engagements and have space for both of us to be learning and growing, we were able to have that conversation and it wasn't personal. And I'm sharing that with you because it's an example of what can happen when you have that built-in trust and when you're listening to yourself. So another example could be if you are making an effort, as we all should, to use the correct pronouns for your team members. It's very possible that you may misgender someone unintentionally, or you may not know, or you may make an assumption. And oftentimes, if you're aware of gender pronouns, you may correct yourself in real time. And that's an example of how you can reflect transparently with yourself and others. You can say, I'm sorry, apologize, correct quickly, and move forward. That's another example of how compassionate accountability can work in practice. So what are the responsibilities of managers in creating a culture of compassionate accountability? I know that many of you are Millennial Manager Collective members. And I think pretty much everyone on this call has been in a leadership position in some way. I'm willing to make that assumption. And so we're going to talk about the specifics of what that looks like. So compassionate accountability, I mentioned this a little bit earlier. It takes the power dynamics out of it. It's a non-hierarchical, systemic approach to anti-racist leadership. And managers can use this as a model for personal self-leadership as well as organization-wide policy. You can do it with colleagues that you see, if you are in a hierarchical relationship, you can create those trusting relationships between people who you consider your peers, but you can also venture beyond that and see your workplace as a collective where all members, regardless of roles, are participating in this culture of accountability. And there's a certain level of trust. And so you can operationalize this. You can write down some of these guidelines in organization-wide policy, and you can also make them transparent, whether it's sending an email or having a one-on-one conversation or a conversation with a small group, normalizing these calling in moments, normalizing these self-reflection moments. So it does become expected that there will be moments of learning that are transparent with yourself and with others. Compassionate accountability is a way for managers to care about employee well-being, to help prevent burnout, both of yourself and for your employees. There's nothing more stressful than trying to commit to an anti-racist program or model, or what we would say anti-racist living. You're starting out, and maybe this is new to you. It's not about being perfect. It's about the long journey. It's about the process. And so we don't want anyone to be burning out with compassionate accountability. This kind of creates a little bit more spaciousness for real-time learning. And your employees will probably have a greater sense of belonging, as Camila discussed, with just the psychology of the brain. And so you can retain your team members with this practice as well.
And on this slide as well, we do have an image of 4 hands that are crossing over each other in a square formation. One of them is dark purple, one is green, one's orange, and one is pink.
Thanks, Camila.
Of course. So Rachel talked a little bit about the role of the manager in creating compassionately accountable workplaces. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of the individual. So on this slide, we have an image in the upper left-hand corner of a globe. It's in blue and green, and you can see North America, South America, a little bit of Europe and Africa. And in the lower right-hand corner, it is a pink heart. So it's really important to remember that ultimately, ultimately it should be our systems that are creating a space where every person can thrive. That's ultimately where things should be rooted. So the burden of eradicating systemic oppression does not fall on the individual. Ultimately, that's not how it should be. And individuals can participate in the collective process. And this can look like different things at different times. Sometimes, especially if we have marginalized identities or multiple marginalized identities, sometimes our role might be doing the work of caring for ourselves and making sure that we are able to be resourced and rested and our mental health is in a good space. And there are maybe times where we're able to do more work, and we may be actively looking at our budgets and figuring out how we can make sure that that is reflective of a workplace that supports diversity, equity, and inclusion. So it can look like different things at different times. I think the other thing too is that, again, that if we're looking at these microaffirmations, if we're looking at small ways that we're building community, that's a really easy way to consistently be engaging with this, smiling, asking our colleagues how their day is going, taking time to have lunch with someone new, doing those check-ins, or really just acknowledging the work that your colleagues are doing. So I think that's something that is really important. I think other times, again, we want to be considering where we are in different spaces and time, and I'll go into that in a little bit. But again, we each can take a role. For example, right now within Kneading Change, I might not be able to be fully invested in our work all the time, and Rachel might be taking a greater portion of like the work that we do. Or I might let Rachel know, I'm really wanting to make sure that I'm not using crazy in my terminology, because that can be a really microaggressive comment. So if you see me, or if you hear me using that word, could you please call me in and just catch that for me if I don't catch myself? So there can be a lot of different ways that this can look.
Yeah, I completely agree.
So we're going to just walk through a little exercise for workplace accountability. You can just consider some of these questions now, and we invite you, if you watch this video later, to take a moment to pause and to really write out your answers to these as well. So the first question to consider is, in what spaces do you have influence and privilege at work? And these can be as small as the autonomy you have over your own breath and posture, and as large as approving annual budgets or developing new programs. But be sure to think of the influence you have on individual relationships as well as larger systems.
Yeah.
Secondly, in each of these spaces, think about what actions you'll take to practice compassionate accountability. And then third, in each of these spaces, what questions do you need to answer to help you deepen your compassionate accountability? And you may also want to just think back to our conversation about microaggressions and think about, do you have an identity too that might allow you to speak with less risk or pushback if a microaggression does happen?
Mhm. Yeah, and I think it's really important. In the beginning of the talk, I emphasized that compassionate accountability removes that power dynamic, because in accountability, you often think of one person who's chiding or condemning another. And in that way, power is removed. But from a social justice framework, we know that power is always present, particularly when it comes to how systems relate to our identities. And we're not all experiencing the same thing when we're living in an environment where systemic injustice is everywhere. And so as you go through these questions, thinking about what's true for me, thinking about, what does it look like for me to care for myself, but also what does it look like for me to care for others? And that's going to be very individualized.
So, some final thoughts on creating a culture of compassionate accountability. On this slide, we have a image of tree rings in green. And this is really to represent that compassionate accountability and engaging with this work is a lifelong journey. You are going to have moments of greater capacity and lesser capacity, especially if you do hold marginalized identities. Like I mentioned earlier, there may be times where your work might be doing more of the internal work and catching yourself. Other times it's going to be fostering interpersonal relationships. Other times it might be at that more systemic level. Ultimately, we're really trying to address the system so that way we can actually have a culture where we don't necessarily need to be worrying about all of the systemic injustices that currently exist. There are going to be times as well, again, with it being a lifelong journey, where you are going to be making mistakes, but it's really about building the muscle and coming back to this work again and again. How can we have this compassion accountability? I messed up. I'm going to reflect. I'm going to do the inner work and then come back to the same thing and keep going, keep trying. And that's really essential. And the key is that you are always doing something. Again, whether that's taking that time to get to know your colleagues, or whether it's looking at calling in greater systems and doing the work there. Is there anything else you'd like to add to that, Rachel?
Yeah, I think I'll just add that many of us, especially in the last few years, have been exposed to books about anti-racist leadership or anti-racist living, and what is the anti-racist journey? And there's conversations, and it's a highly personal experience. but thinking about what does that look like in the workplace, it's more than your diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging program, right? This conversation today is about making that fluid transition between work and home. This is how you're living your life. And as managers, you can add that question of how can I make this a part of the workplace culture so the burden is not on my employees to bring this mindset to work. And then, of course, how can I educate my employees if they don't have these resources at home to learn and contribute these ideas into a workplace that's inclusive, accessible, and affirming for everyone. So yeah, doing a little bit of blending. It shouldn't, with practice, it's less of a burden and more of a habit, but a habit in a way that enhances the environment.
Thank you, Rachel. I think the other element of that goes along with what you said too is that a lot of times too, we might hear, oh, I'm an ally, or we have a DEI program. And ultimately, if I hear that, I'm going to be less inclined to think that has depth. I want you to show me and come from that base level of actually showing me that you're doing this. When I walk into your workplace environment, do I get a sense that people are engaged with one another and deeply care about one another? That tells me a lot more than having the DEI label on things or having a poster that you're an ally. So just thinking about, as Rachel was saying, how is this deeply ingrained into the work? If there were no title, would I be able to tell that there's compassionate accountability here? And I would love to invite you all to follow Rachel and I, Kneading Change, on LinkedIn. You can see I'll pop this into the chat as well. You can follow us at Kneading Change. And then I would love to just open the space for questions. And thank you so much, Marissa, for having Rachel and I be present in this space.
Yes, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to join you today.
Thank you so much for sharing. I'm sure there are many burning questions in the room. Before we get there, I just want to say that we are going to be stopping the recording. Is LinkedIn the best way for Rachel and to reach you, Rachel or Camila? Are there other ways that you would like to be contacted?
Yeah, you can share our email, our info
Okay.
at Kneading Change. Yeah, feel free to reach out.
All right. So info@kneadingchange.org. If you are tuning in later, they will be excited to chat with you. So I'm going to stop this